The air inside the gym hung thick with sweat and the sharp tang of disinfectant. It was just past 8 on a Tuesday evening in late summer, and the last martial arts class of the day had wrapped up. Most students had already peeled off their gloves and headed out into the humid Georgia night. But a small group lingered near the mats, still buzzing from the energy of sparring. They laughed loudly, replaying moves, exaggerating near misses, feeding off each other's adrenaline. At the center of it all stood the instructor, confident, lean, and wearing his black belt like a second skin. He moved with the kind of ease that came from years of discipline, but also from being used to people watching him, respecting him, maybe even fearing him a little. Outside the ring of chatter, unnoticed by most, a man pushed a mop across the scuffed linoleum floor near the water fountain. His uniform was simple: dark blue work pants, a slightly faded polo shirt with the gym's logo stitched in white thread, and worn-out sneakers that made no sound as he worked. He kept his head down, not out of shame, but habit. Years of moving through spaces where people looked right through him had taught him that silence was often the safest language. He wasn't invisible. He was just background noise, like the hum of the AC or the squeak of sneakers on hardwood. Someone in the group finally noticed him. "Yo, check it out," one of the younger guys said, nudging his friend. "Even the broom looks scared of Calvin." The comment landed like a tossed pebble, small, but enough to ripple through the group. Laughter followed, not cruel exactly, but careless, the kind that comes when you're sure no one important is listening. The instructor, let's just call him Coach, turned, arms crossed, a half-smile playing on his lips. He watched the janitor for a moment, then called out, voice light but carrying, "Hey, Calvin, ever throw a punch?" The mop stopped. Calvin didn't look up right away. He finished the stroke he was on, wrung out the mop head in the bucket with slow, deliberate movements, and only then turned his head. His eyes were calm, tired but clear. "Not unless I have to," he said, voice low but steady. That was all it took. The group exchanged glances. A dare formed in the air without anyone saying the word outright. One of the students grinned. "Man, Coach, you're a third-degree black belt. You could teach him a thing or two." Another chimed in. "Yeah, just one round. For fun." The words "for fun" hung there, light and dangerous, like tossing a match into dry grass. Coach hesitated for only a second. He wasn't a bad person, just proud, and used to being the strongest one in the room. He liked the way people leaned in when he spoke, the way new students watched his every move like he held some secret to power, and right now with his crew watching, backing down felt like losing. So he shrugged as if it were nothing. "All right, Calvin. One round. Just for fun." Calvin didn't move. He just looked at Coach, really looked at him, in a way that made the laughter die down a little. There was no anger in his face, no fear, just something deeper, something the younger man couldn't quite name. After a long pause, Calvin set the mop against the wall. He didn't take off his shirt or stretch or do any of the things fighters usually do before stepping onto the mat. He just walked over, slow and steady, like he was heading to the break room for coffee. The students scrambled to clear the center of the room, pulling mats into place, phones already out. No one thought to ask if Calvin wanted to do this. No, one considered that maybe he had reasons for keeping his hands to himself. They just assumed he'd say yes, or that if he didn't, it wouldn't matter much anyway. He was the janitor. What was he going to do? But as Calvin stepped onto the edge of the mat, something shifted. He stood with his feet shoulder-width, apart, hands open at his sides, palms facing forward. Not in a fighting stance, but in a posture of readiness that had nothing to do with aggression. His shoulders were relaxed, but his eyes never left Coach's. There was a stillness about him that made the room feel smaller, quieter, even though no one had stopped breathing. Coach bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, rolling his shoulders, flashing that easy grin again. "Don't worry," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll go easy." The group chuckled, but it sounded thinner now, less sure. What they didn't know, what none of them could see, was the weight Calvin carried in those quiet seconds. He wasn't thinking about kicks or blocks or how to win. He was thinking about his daughter asleep in her dorm room upstate, studying to be a nurse, He was thinking about the promise he'd made to himself after his son passed. Never to raise, his voice in anger. Never to let pride drag him into a fight that wouldn't bring anyone back. He was thinking about the years he'd spent learning that real strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but how well you could hold yourself together when everything inside you wanted to break. He'd worked this job for 6 years, never missed a shift, always showed up early, stayed late if needed. He'd fixed leaky faucets, calmed down angry members, even helped a lost kid find his mom once. But no one had ever really seen him, until now, when they wanted a show. Coach stepped forward, throwing a light jab, not meant to land, just to test. Calvin didn't flinch, didn't move. The punch stopped inches from his face, and for the first time, Coach looked uncertain. The room was dead silent now. Even the AC seemed to pause. Calvin spoke so softly that only those closest could hear. "You sure this is what you want?" His voice wasn't challenging. It was almost sad, like he already knew how this would end, and it wouldn't be with a knockout or a cheer. Coach swallowed. He glanced at his students, their phones still raised, eyes wide. Backing out now would make him look weak. But something in Calvin's gaze made him feel strangely exposed, like the belt around his waist suddenly meant nothing. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, though it came out quieter than he intended. "Let's go." And in that moment, before the first real move was even made, something had already changed. Not in the room, but in the air between them. Because sometimes the most powerful fights aren't the ones you win with your fists, but the ones you refuse to start. And no one in that gym knew it yet, but they were about to learn that lesson in a way they'd never forget. Calvin stood there, hands still open at his sides, and the silence stretched like a held breath. The gym lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across the mats. He could feel every eye on him, the curious, the nervous, the ones already imagining how this would play out on their phone screens later. But none of them knew what lived behind his quietness. None of them had walked the roads he'd walked or carried the kind of silence that comes after loss. He wasn't always like this. There was a time years ago when he'd been quick to react, when a sharp word or a shove would send his blood racing, his fists clenching before his mind caught up. Back then, he thought strength meant never backing down. He learned the hard way that sometimes the real fight isn't with the person in front of you, it's with the part of yourself that wants to prove something that doesn't need proving. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where respect was often measured in inches, how close you let someone get before you pushed back. He'd seen friends disappear into jail cells or worse, all because they couldn't walk away from a challenge that wasn't really about them. Then came the army. He didn't talk about it much, but those years taught him something deeper. That control was harder than combat, and restraint took more courage than rage. After his service, he came home hoping for peace. He got a job, found a small apartment, and focused on raising his son, the bright-eyed boy who loved drawing superheroes and asking endless questions about space. For a while, life felt steady. Then, during his son's senior year of high school, everything shattered. A stupid argument outside a convenience store, a shove, a fall, a head hitting concrete. Just like that, the future he'd worked so hard to build was gone. The grief didn't scream. It settled in his bones like a second shadow. And in the months that followed, one truth became clear. Violence never brought anything back. It only took more. Now, standing on this gym mat, surrounded by people who saw him as part of the scenery, Calvin felt that old ache rise, not for revenge, but for understanding. He didn't want to fight, but he also knew that saying no would confirm what they already believed, that he was harmless, powerless, someone to be teased or tested without consequence. And maybe, just maybe, this moment, however foolish, was a chance to show them something they hadn't considered. He looked at the instructor again. The man was younger, fit, trained. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years mastering his body. But confidence and wisdom weren't the same thing. Calvin had seen plenty of strong men make weak choices. "All right," Calvin said finally, his voice low but clear. "If I do this, you listen when it's over." The instructor blinked, caught off guard. He'd expected fear, maybe anger, or even a quick surrender. Not this calm condition. He laughed it off, trying to keep the mood light. "Sure, man. Whatever you say," but Calvin didn't smile. He just nodded once like a man sealing a promise. Someone hit play on a phone alarm, a cheap imitation of a boxing bell. The sound was tinny, almost silly, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The instructor bounced on his toes, throwing a few light jabs into the air, showing off for the group. "Come on, Calvin. Show us what you got." His voice was playful, but there was an edge to it now, nerves disguised as bravado. Calvin didn't move. He stayed rooted, eyes steady. He wasn't waiting for an opening to strike. He was waiting for the right moment to speak. The instructor feinted left, then lunged with a quick right hook, meant to graze Calvin's jaw, just enough to startle him, to get a laugh. It was a show move, flashy but controlled. But Calvin didn't duck or block. Instead, he stepped forward, into the arc of the punch, closing the distance in one smooth motion. Before anyone could react, he was inches from the instructor's face, close enough to see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. And then, quietly so only the instructor could hear, Calvin said, "My son died because he thought proving himself meant throwing fists." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The instructor froze mid-motion, arm still half raised. The playful smirk vanished. His breath caught. Behind them, the group fell completely silent. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the phones lowered slightly as if sensing this wasn't content anymore. It was something real. Calvin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was 17, he continued, voice barely above a whisper but carrying through the room like thunder. Got into it with some kids over nothing, just pride, just noise. One push, one fall. That was it. He paused, and for the first time his eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. "I spent years teaching him to be strong, but I never taught him that walking away takes more strength than swinging." The instructor slowly lowered his arm. His chest rose and fell quickly like he'd just run a mile. He looked at Calvin, not at the uniform, not at the mop waiting by the wall, but at the man standing before him, shoulders heavy with a story no one had bothered to ask for. Calvin stepped back, returning to his original stance, hands open again.
"You want to win?"
he said, voice softer now. "Win by walking away from the need to prove you're better than someone." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his bucket. He picked up the mop, dipped it in the soapy water, and began mopping the spot near the water fountain again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The students stood frozen, unsure what to do. One of them finally turned off the phone recording. Another cleared his throat, but no sound came out. The instructor just stood there on the mat, staring at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. No punches had been thrown. No one had fallen. But something inside that room had shifted, deeply, permanently. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise, but changes the air you breathe. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware. Cars passed. Streetlights flickered on. But inside the gym, time had slowed, stretched thin by a truth spoken not in anger, but in sorrow, and in hope. Calvin kept mopping. His movements were steady, practiced. He didn't look for approval or reaction. He'd said what needed saying. The rest wasn't up to him. And in that quiet continuation of ordinary work, mop, rinse, wring, repeat, he offered the most powerful lesson of all, that dignity doesn't need a stage. It just needs to be lived, even when no one's watching, especially then. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that feels empty. It was thick, heavy, like the air before a storm breaks, but without the thunder. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the usual background hum of the gym, the distant clank of weights, the buzz of fluorescent lights seemed to hush out of respect. The instructor stood frozen on the mat, his arms limp at his sides, his chest rising and falling a little too fast. His face, usually so sure of itself, now looked like someone who'd just woken up in a place he didn't recognize. One of the students finally lowered his phone. Not because he was told to, but because it suddenly felt wrong to hold it up, like pointing a camera at a prayer. Another shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes darting between the instructor and the janitor, unsure where to land. They'd come for a show, something quick and flashy to laugh about later. Instead, they'd been handed something raw and real, something that didn't fit into a 15-second clip. Calvin kept mopping. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew what he'd said had landed, not because he wanted to shame anyone, but because sometimes truth is the only thing that cuts through noise. He'd spent most of his life being overlooked, spoken over, assumed to be harmless simply because he chose peace over performance. But peace wasn't weakness. It was a choice, one he'd paid for in ways no one in that room could imagine. Still, he didn't expect what came next. The instructor took a slow step off the mat. Then another. He walked toward Calvin, not with swagger but with something closer to humility. When he was a few feet away, he stopped. I didn't know, he said, voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. Calvin paused, wrung out the mop, and finally looked up. Most people don't, he said simply, that was all. No anger, no lecture. Just 2 words that carried the weight of 1,000 unseen stories. The instructor swallowed hard. He glanced back at his students who were now watching him with new eyes, not as their fearless leader, but as someone who'd just made a very human mistake. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. And for the first time that night, it sounded like he meant it, not just for the dare, but for everything that led up to it, the jokes, the assumptions, the casual way they'd treated Calvin like part of the furniture. Calvin nodded once. Apology accepted. Then he went back to mopping, but the moment didn't end there. One of the younger students, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, stepped forward. "Hey, can I ask you something?" His voice was hesitant, almost shy. Calvin stopped again. "Sure. Were you ever trained? Like in fighting or anything?" Calvin considered the question. He didn't answer right away. He leaned on the mop handle, looking not at the floor but out the gym's front window where the streetlights cast long golden streaks across the parking lot. "I was trained to protect," he said finally. "Not to perform." The words hung in the air. The student blinked, then nodded slowly, like he was filing that sentence away for later. Another voice piped up from the back. "What do you mean by that?" Calvin turned slightly, meeting their eyes one by one. "Real training isn't about showing off. It's about knowing when not to use what you know. My drill sergeant used to say, 'The best fighter is the one who walks away clean, no bruises, no regrets.' I didn't understand it then. Took me losing everything to get it." No one spoke for a long moment. Then the instructor said quietly, "You could have taken me, couldn't you?" Calvin gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe, but what would that prove? That I'm stronger, faster? That doesn't make me better. It just makes me different." He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred in places, but steady. "Strength isn't about what you can break. It's about what you choose to hold together." The group stood there, absorbing it. This wasn't the kind of wisdom you got from YouTube tutorials or highlight reels. This was earned, lived, paid for in sleepless nights and quiet mornings. Slowly, the students began to drift away, not in embarrassment, but in thought. One helped roll up the spare mats. Another wiped down the water fountain. No one said much, but their actions spoke louder than words. The mood had shifted from entertainment to something closer to reverence. The instructor stayed behind. He watched Calvin finish the last few feet of the hallway, his movements methodical, unhurried. When Calvin reached the supply closet, he turned. "You teach people how to fight," he said gently. "Maybe it's time you also teach them why not to." The instructor didn't argue. He just nodded. "I will." That night, as Calvin clocked out and walked to his old sedan parked in the far corner of the lot, he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired, but the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after you've done something honest. He drove home through quiet streets, windows down, letting the warm night air wash over him. His daughter had texted earlier, just a photo of her cat curled up on a textbook captioned "Studying Hard." He smiled. That was his real victory. Not belts or titles or proving himself to strangers. It was showing up day after day, choosing kindness over ego, even when no one was watching. Back at the gym, the instructor sat alone on the edge of the mat for a long time. He replayed the moment over and over, the way Calvin had stepped into the punch not to strike but to speak. The calm in his voice, the weight behind his words. For the first time in years, he questioned what he'd been teaching. Was it discipline or just dominance dressed up as skill? By morning, he'd made a decision. He wouldn't cancel class, but he would change it. And when the students returned the next evening, they found something new taped to the wall beside the mirror. A single sheet of paper with 3 words written in bold marker: respect, restraint, responsibility. No explanation. No fanfare. Just a quiet reminder that real strength doesn't roar. It listens. It waits. It chooses. And somewhere, miles away, a man in a worn blue uniform poured himself a cup of tea, turned on the news, and let the day go. He didn't know his words had already started a ripple, but that was okay. He'd never needed credit. He just needed to be heard once. And that night, in a gym full of people who thought they knew what power looked like, he'd shown them a different kind entirely. In the days that followed, something quiet began to move through the gym, like a breeze you feel before you see the leaves stir. No one talked about it outright, not at first. But people noticed. The way students held the door open for the night janitor. How someone always made sure the water fountain area was clean before he got there. How laughter near the mats had lost its edge, replaced by a kind of thoughtful energy that hadn't been there before. The video, grainy, shaky, shot on a phone, did circulate. Not on flashy reels or viral pages, but in private messages, in group chats among the regulars. It wasn't shared for shock value or drama. People sent it with notes like, "Watch this." Really watch it. And when they did, they didn't see a fight. They saw a man standing still while the world expected him to swing. They saw dignity in silence. And that somehow hit harder than any knockout ever could. The instructor didn't post it. He didn't even keep the original clip. After watching it once, alone late at night with the gym empty and the lights dimmed, he deleted it from his phone. Not because he was ashamed, but because he realized some moments aren't meant to be replayed. They're meant to be lived through, learned from, and carried forward without turning them into content. He canceled his next 2 classes, not out of guilt, but to think. He sat in his apartment, flipping through old training manuals, reading quotes from masters he'd once skimmed over. One line kept coming back to him. The highest martial art is not to fight at all. He'd read it 100 times before, but now it felt like it was speaking directly to him. When he returned to the gym, he didn't walk in with a grand speech. He just showed up early, set up the mats himself, and waited. When the first student arrived, he looked them in the eye and said, "Before we train today, I owe you all an apology." And he meant it, not just for the dare, but for the culture he'd helped create, where skill was measured by speed and power, not by character. He started something new that week, a short segment at the end of every class called Conflict Without Combat. No punches, no kicks, just conversation, role-playing, and real-life scenarios. What do you do when someone cuts you off in traffic? When a coworker insults you in front of others? When pride whispers that you have to respond with force, with words, with something? He taught them to pause, to breathe, to ask, "Is this worth my peace?" At first, some students rolled their eyes. A few even quit, saying it wasn't real martial arts. But others stayed. And slowly, the energy in the room changed. Sparring became less about winning and more about control. Respect wasn't just a word on the wall. It became part of how they moved, how they spoke, how they held space for each other. Meanwhile, Calvin kept doing his job. Same hours, same route, same quiet presence. But now when he walked in, people greeted him by name. Not "Hey man" or "Yo janitor," but "Good evening, Calvin." Some asked how his week was going. One young woman brought him a thermos of homemade soup when she heard he'd been under the weather. He accepted it with a nod and a soft thank you, but inside it meant more than they knew. He never asked for attention, never sought praise. But after that night, he stopped being invisible. Not because he changed, but because they finally started seeing him. One evening, as he was restocking paper towels in the locker room, one of the newer students lingered by the door. "Can I ask you something?" the kid said, shuffling his feet like he wasn't sure he had the right. Calvin turned. "Sure. Do you ever miss it, the fighting, I mean? If you were trained and everything." Calvin thought for a moment. "I miss the discipline," he said finally. "The focus. The way training sharpens your mind as much as your body. But the fighting? No, fighting takes something from you even when you win. It leaves a mark you can't always see." The student nodded slowly. "My dad always said, don't fight unless you have to, but I never really got it until that night." Calvin gave a small smile. "Your dad was smart." Later that week, the instructor approached him near the front desk. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. "Would you be willing to say a few words to the class sometime? Not about fighting, just about what you said that night. About choice. About walking away." Calvin hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his thing. He preferred actions to speeches. But then he thought about his son, the boy who never got the chance to learn this lesson. Maybe sharing it could help someone else avoid the same pain. "I'll think about it," he said. He didn't say yes right away. But he didn't say no either. Around the same time, the gym owner, a woman who rarely stepped onto the floor, called the instructor into her office. She'd heard what happened. She'd seen the shift in the atmosphere. "Whatever you're doing," she told him, "keep doing it. This place feels different now. Better." That meant more than a raise ever could. Outside the gym, life went on as usual. Traffic jams, rainy mornings, bills to pay. But inside those walls, something had taken root. It wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines, but it was real. People started holding themselves differently, not just in stances, but in how they carried their pride, their patience, their humanity. And Calvin? He still mopped the floors, still clocked in at 7 p.m., still drove home in his old sedan, windows down, radio low. But now, when he passed the gym in the daylight, he sometimes saw students practicing not just kicks and blocks, but deep breaths and calm replies. And that, more than anything, told him the message had landed. No one was perfect. Mistakes still happened. Egos still flared. But now there was a pause, a space between reaction and response, and in that space people were learning to choose better. It wasn't about becoming saints. It was about becoming human. Fully, honestly, gently human. And sometimes all it took was one quiet man, one open palm, and a truth spoken not to shame but to heal.